Hey everyone, Carmen here, Ms. Digital Editor with Soraya Chemaly, the one and only. And today we are talking about Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger, Soraya's new book that came out 2 weeks ago now.
Yes.
And spoiler alert, it is amazing.
Thank you.
It's not the only book on women's anger coming out right now, and I feel like it could not come at a better time, unfortunately. But there's definitely, I think, a lot of rage, so I'm hoping we can work through some. And actually, I felt like I wanted to start with, when I was reading this book, towards the end you asked the question of, can you read or write a book on anger without getting angry? I just wrote in the margins on the page, I was like, no. Yeah, reading this book made me very angry, but also in the way where it made me angry in a way where I wanted to take action, fight back, start, transforming this anger into this fuel for the work that I do. And there's a story that you tell in here about when a man grabbed you by the arm and you punched him in the face out of reflex. And you say that it was the first and last time you allowed your anger to overcome your fear. And I'm just wondering, why was that the last time?
So I was 15 and I was walking down a busy street. It's actually still today kind of a gauntlet for girls and women. Like, you can't walk from one end of the street to the other without someone saying something, maybe touching you, following you down the street. And so anyway, I was going pretty fast and he grabbed my arm and jerked me back and he said, I want to get a good look at you. And just by reflex, I punched him in the throat and he let go of me, but then he started screaming obscenities. And he was much bigger than I was and older than I was. And so I had that immediate flash where it was really hard to distinguish between anger and fear. And I just bolted. And he couldn't really follow me or didn't really follow me. But I remember thinking, okay, I didn't think in the moment. And I'm glad he let go of me, but that was dangerous because actually there were so many opportunities for him to hit me back or grab me or throw me to the ground. And so I don't think it was even conscious. I just know that in other situations, and there are other situations like that, I just didn't have that instinctive response. I somehow folded into myself this consciousness that that's not a good option for me, which is interesting, right? Because we often think of in terms of anger and threat as fight or flight.
Yeah.
And that's not really a good binary choice for women because it doesn't work so well for us if we are smaller or slower. And so I talk in the book about tend and befriend and freeze behaviors. You feel threatened, sometimes you freeze so that you can think. Or, and this is clear, studies show, women do actually have a different physiological response, which leads them to try and tend and befriend. So maybe you smile when you don't mean to smile because you think it will de-escalate the situation and not cause somebody to act violently.
Yeah, and I was curious too, when I was sort of leafing through the book and making notes for our talk today, about what led you back to rage.
Honestly, I felt that I came to the conclusion that I was deeply disassociated from my own emotions of anger because I had managed them for so long, right? And I think, 15 years ago, if you'd say to me, are you angry? I would say, oh no, I'm not angry. I'm just not an angry person, But that takes its toll. And it was definitely taking a toll on me. And what I found when I started writing, which again was a sort of unconscious way of channeling this anger, was that I could be very angry through my fingertips. I could write things and not even understand how much anger was clear in what I was writing that are super difficult to say out loud. Because I think there are a lot of prohibitions on girls and women to even articulating their anger, right? Like, there is a danger in articulating the anger verbally. Yeah. And so that was an adaptation and a transformation, I think, of this emotion, because it will find its way. Like, it's not that we're generating more anger. What I'm trying to explain is there is anger. We just need to acknowledge it, figure out how it's manifesting itself. And instead of letting us or hurt our relationships or our professional lives, we should actually take a step back and think, okay, what do I do with this immense reserve of energy, and how do I channel it to reach the objectives that I have?
Yeah, well, and that's why I'm so glad you just said that that the anger came out in your writing, because I have been hearing from so many of the writers I work with here at Ms. this week, especially, and last week, literally just getting emails that are like, I am so angry, can I write something?
Yes, can I write something?
I am so angry, can I write something? Everyone go check out the stuff they wrote. But I loved that the book focused on this idea that we are angry for a reason, that you go through and you break down all of these different reasons that women have to deserve this anger that we are processing. And then also that anger can be this righteous and good emotion, that it's a survival emotion and not a problem emotion, And so I'm kind of curious too, for people watching at home, for folks who haven't read the book yet, sort of how do we harness that rage that I think a lot of people are feeling right now with what's happening with Brett Kavanaugh, with what's been happening with the Trump administration's policies that are constantly pushing us backwards.
Well, it's exhausting.
Yeah, and
really
sort of
exhausting.
How do we channel that rage and, harness it and turn it into momentum? And I think too, not just for right now, not just to stop a nomination or stop one bad policy, but sort of transform this movement we have, and sustain it.
So I think there are several things. One is, for some women, it literally is as simple as being able to say, I'm angry. Some people have a very difficult time saying that, and for good reasons, right? I mean, we understand the risks because they're real, and we learn to be nurturers, and we learn to be people who are supposed to support other people. So breaking connections by displaying anger is difficult. That's really incompatible, right?
Yeah.
But I think that if you can think about the anger, what it means, because as Audre Lorde said, it's full of information, and you need to understand what it means. And then I think the risk doesn't become alienating the people around you as much as coming to terms with whether they care or not. Because if you articulate anger about something that's important to you, which usually comes from a place of a sense of unfairness or injustice or betrayal, when you say you're angry, it makes demands on people around you. And I think it's very hard sometimes to realize that maybe they don't care enough to validate your anger or to stop and say, why are you angry, right? And that's hard a lot of the times. But I think that if you can name the anger, so it's called affect labeling, which is super useful psychologically, and then think, what can I do with this? What do you do best? You don't have to go create a new way to be, right? But if you are a writer, write. If you are a musician, write music. If you are a community activist, organize, right? And I think too that anger is really isolating if you are not able to express it or freely share it. And finding a community that shares the way you feel about things can be incredibly powerful and useful, because then you can see the way the issues that are affecting you personally have public resonance and have political strength. And I think that's one of the most important things that we're seeing now. I mean, we're seeing that happen.
Yeah, totally. And that was also something that I felt like moving through the book, this idea that anger feels personal but is political, like every other, issue that faces women.
Right.
And sort of this question of how rarely people actually interrogate how discrimination makes women feel, because everyone's too busy debating whether or not we're actually experiencing discrimination or violence or harm, or even unfair treatment. And you also detail ways in which we're maybe losing ground, ways in which, younger men are less likely to see sexism. And I was very struck by the idea that men really have trouble grasping sort of how tangible sexism is in women's lives.
That's clear from lots of studies.
Like how impactful it is, and then also how it's manifesting in their own relationships. Like they're sort of they have a lot of blinders on. And so I'm curious, how do you think we move past that wall of, because I think that that's obviously something that's held us back for so long, is this idea of we all see a problem,
Right.
you know.
Well, not
women,
all of us.
Well, yes, many of us.
Many of us see a problem.
Yeah, are
Yes.
like, hey, unequal pay,
Yes.
rape culture, education inequity. We see these things and we all see them together, and then there's just this large group of people who can't fathom that that's the reality
Right.
they live in. How do you think we break through that wall?
So I think there are a few things, because you see that operate in lots of ways, right? So you see men's denials of what women are saying. You see white women's denials of what black women are saying. And so the dynamics of those are very often very similar, right? And so from one perspective, well, I think of it in four ways. One is that it's hard to admit to privilege. So if women are saying these things, for men to believe us, they have to actually acknowledge that they have a certain type of privilege that we do not enjoy, whatever that may be in the context of the conversation. The second and third are related to masculinity. So boys learn very quickly to associate masculinity with two key ideas, providing and protecting, right? And so if a woman comes to you and she says, you know, I can't walk down the street at night and that frustrates me because it's really not safe, what happens actually is it gets sort of flipped over into I'm failing to protect. And failure doesn't feel good. And in fact, it's an impossible ideal. Men cannot protect the women around them. And indeed, intimate relationships are far more dangerous than stranger relationships, right? And so silencing or minimizing or denying the fact that, yes, we have these problems is psychologically palliative. It makes you maybe feel a little better, right? And the same thing with providing. I mean, we know that when women make more money, their spouses, if they're in heterosexual relationships, and men are 5 times more likely to have affairs and to leave them, right? And so there's all of this masculine identity and the protection of masculine identity that is really tied to the acknowledgement or lack of acknowledgement of discrimination against women. And so I think that I said privilege, providing, protecting, and I think all of those come down to the last one, which is this identity protective cognition. What happens when I encounter information that is deeply challenging to my sense of self? You know, if you can't protect, does that mean you're a bad man? Because you've been told you've got to do this the whole time. But as someone said to me earlier this morning, that's all very generous. It's just about power. You know?
Yeah. Well, and I did enjoy too that you talked about this notion of miscommunication or misunderstanding.
Yes.
This idea that, you know, oh, well, it's just difficult for someone to understand, when in reality, you know, it might just be more comfortable for someone to continue enjoying their privilege than to sort of own up to the ways in which they are maybe enjoying or taking part in an unfair system.
And I think actually the difficult part too is if you're having conversations with people in your family or neighbors or friends, you can't say, well, you just have more power, right? Yeah. That doesn't lead anywhere. It really doesn't. Like that doesn't make a better conversation necessarily happen, even if it's true, right? And men don't feel that they have more power. Yeah. That's just not the case. You know, there are men who have power over other men. And so it gets very complicated. And to me, the goal is to make it possible to have conversations that lead to a change of behavior. And so if a man is truly, genuinely interested in what a woman might be saying to him, it doesn't require him to double down on paternalism or controlling protective behavior. It actually requires that he generally confront other men, right? And interrogate masculinity and say, hey, you know what, that joke's actually not that funny. Yeah. Or, I mean, look at Kavanaugh right now. Like the assaults that Kavanaugh has been accused of, as he himself has pointed out, haven't involved his genitals, right? That's basically what he said. You know, those are assaults in which women were degraded and humiliated for fun. Yeah. And they were degraded and humiliated for fun in an environment where men were communicating or boys were communicating with other men. It wasn't even so much about these women, which is even worse, right? And so it means that men have to push back against the very strong pressures they have to adhere to fraternal norms.
Yeah. Well, and I think also that so much of this stuff is bound up in how hard it is still for women to not only just express it themselves,
Right.
because I sort of also made a note to let you know that one of the first things I did when I started reading the book, because you talked about, rumination and the ways we're socialized to just hold in the anger so early on. And one of the first things I did was I took my phone out and I just started texting people and saying,
I was really mad in 1989.
Yes, exactly. This was very hard for me to work through, but I'm just letting you know I was angry the other day. I was angry a month ago when you said that to me, and that's why,
And what responses did you get?
Well, and I think that that's the thing, right, is we're always afraid of the conflict that could come, but telling your friends that you're angry, and you say this in the book, that's just part of having a healthy and honest relationship with people. And it is really mind-boggling to realize the ways in which we don't have the space to have those emotions, to hold court over those emotions. And I think so much of that too is, changing that narrative of what women are, and then also sort of digging out the space for women's anger and for claiming it. I enjoyed that you called it the moral property of women. And how do you think, culturally, how do you think we do make more room for women's anger, more room for the anger that already exists to sort of be more visible, and not always in this reactive way of this one specific political thing provoked us, this one result of an election provoked us, but in a way where on an everyday basis, like, how do you think we make more space?
So I think there are several things. One is clearly socializing children. Catch yourself if you realize, and we all do it because we have biases, that you're maybe applying double standards to the behaviors of children, because they learn very quickly that there are some very powerful double standards around anger, right? And what happens to a lot of little girls is that they're expected to, as you say, be quiet about how they feel in order to support the development of a young boy, maybe, who is acting out or is being held to different standards of self-regulation, right? And we also see that in terms of race and ethnicity. So if you are in a school where they're starting in kindergarten, are young Black girls who are being disproportionately disciplined, they're usually being disciplined for behavior that in a young boy, particularly a young white boy, is seen as natural, rambunctious, and maybe leadership potential, right?
Yeah.
And so people adhere to these rules of politeness and what's normal for a little boy and what's normal for a little girl all the time without thinking about it. So girls, for example, are 3 times more likely to be told to use their nice voices. Just stop doing that. Like, that's a simple thing, right?
Yeah.
If a girl is not using her nice voice, ask her why.
Yeah.
That doesn't, she probably has a good reason for that. But if you say use your nice voice, you're literally stopping what she's doing without any curiosity about why she might be doing it, So there's that. And then the other thing too is, and I think this is true throughout our lives, it's very hard for some people to distinguish between assertiveness, just confidently stating your opinion, and aggression, which is a behavior that is difficult for a lot of people, and anger. So you can be assertive without having any aggression and anger. You can be aggressive without any anger. You can be angry without any aggression. I mean, those are 3 very different things, and we tend to elide them in girls and women especially. And so for Black women, that's a real challenge because of this persistent stereotype that's so rooted in racist portrayals of the angry Black woman, right? I mean, for a Black girl or woman to act in self-defense is dangerous very often, right? And so we see a lot of examples of angry white women who are doing things in public. And it's interesting because that comes with an entitlement, right? Like, there's an entitlement anger in culture, and that reflects all kinds of other social hierarchies. But what I find interesting about this anger that we're seeing openly, like, it's not, no one's hiding this anger, right?
Yeah.
Is that it's so gendered and sex segregated. So we have all of these women with nicknames that have, policed lemonade stands and public pools and street corners, and they are acting out the sort of small scale, more private space version of toxic border patrol masculinity that we see nationally, You know, this is the space, this is my space, we're going to build walls, you're not supposed to be here. And we just see that sort of reproduced in smaller levels all over the place with anger. So there are plenty of people who have no problems with their anger, you know, but it's a question of who gets to do that and how that anger is received, which is why, as you said, we think of it as a personal, individual, internal feeling, but it's so powerfully socially constructed.
Yeah, well, and I'm glad too that you talked about sort of how we have to start it early and start with how we raise girls into women and
boys.
Yes,
because they're watching.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've been thinking about since I read the book is when you talk about the idea that women are basically the only people that we are allowed to be angry toward are our mothers. And we're taught in so many ways to, you know, hate our moms. We don't want to be like them when we grow up. We don't want to follow their advice. We are embarrassed by them.
Yeah.
And
it's all acceptable.
Yes, and it's like the only acceptable avenue for our anger. And I brought it up with so many different people because we all have that same experience of, I was having a bad day, so I called my mom and I somehow ended up, you know, yelling at her, like, why did that happen when she didn't do anything to make me angry? And I'm sure my mom is watching right now. Hello, Mom. And it also made me think about the ways in which, like today I was reflecting on how I almost feel like I was also a route for my mother to finally be able to express some indignation and anger. I just always remember that my mother, you know, growing up, I was very rambunctious. Yeah. I was very talkative. I was loud. I was outspoken and opinionated from a very young age. And my mother was, you know, my greatest ally and defender. And she was constantly advocating for me and in assertive ways. And I think, you know, a lot of times with some righteous anger. And then interestingly enough, you know, that ended up also being on the flip side, my own journey of watching, you know, being indignant about what my mom had to go through to raise me and my brother as a single mom has been sort of the main source of fuel for my own activism. And so I'm interested in how you have daughters, how you're raising them into nasty women.
You said so many interesting things there, right? So first of all, yes, we look at the women around us, usually our mothers, our aunts, our grandmothers. And so I kind of structured the book around that idea of a genealogy of anger, right? Like how do we respond? How do we react? How do we look at role models? What do we do about that information? Do we want to be like them or not like them, right? So in my case, my mother was subversively supportive. So I was, like you, loud and rambunctious and very opinionated, but I heard a lot of lower your voice, you know? And, but at the same time, my mother was hugely supportive. And there was a lot of conflict in that for her because she was quite demure. And she'd grown up with a lot of lady lessons, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think that can be very conflicting for some mothers. How do you make sure that your child is a good child as opposed to a good girl, which is different, right? And so as a parent and with my spouse, I think we really strive to do that. We want to build good humans, you know, and if they are girls or boys, you should have the same way of doing that, you know? And so one of the things is, I think, for better or worse, I have always tried to talk to my daughters about anger and their feelings and the place of anger and what you do with it. Like, do you talk about it? Do you internalize it? And it's funny because you can intellectually know something. There's nothing easy about it, right? You can intellectually know something and yet still in and of the culture behave in ways that undermine what you know.
Yeah.
And that's part of just fallibility and being a parent, you know? But I think that the idea of our being taught that it's okay to reject our mothers in adolescence. So adolescence, you know, I have 3 daughters and I can't even count the number of times people said, oh my God, how terrible. Are they teenagers? And, you know, my daughter's adolescence was a great, joyous time. It was just really fun.
Yeah.
You know, there was never a point at which either parent or child felt like, oh, like, go away. It just didn't, you know, but you have to prepare for that. Like, you have to make sure that children are critically aware of what they're getting in the culture. So the movies and the music, and there's so much of it. But what did really strike me when I was writing this, I interviewed so many women, and I realized, and none of them spoke to each other about this, one after another, they talked about acting in defense of their mothers, like you just did, right? So something happens, we watch this thing happen to a person we love, we think hard about it, and then we set out to change it. And that was uniformly true. And yet we have very few dominant cultural narratives or public memory or consciousness of the ways in which daughters defend their mothers.
Yeah.
You know, we have a lot of patriarchal stories of fathers and their sons, you know, and what that relationship is like. But boy, we don't really tell the stories of daughters and mothers very well at all. And I think for all the reasons we know.
Yeah, well, and I know you also in the book do a lot of sort of countering the myths in the stories about the women in your family,
right,
and sort of injecting what you perceived as probably sources of their own anger into these narratives you were being told about, you know, this passive version of their lives. That,
total fairy tale versions of their lives.
That they were okay with being kidnapped and, you know, having, you know, abusive partners and having to care for disproportionately. That obviously they were totally fine. And so, I do. And I mean, I definitely feel like anecdotally, so many of the feminists I meet, you know, it's sort of a genealogy of activism as well. This idea of, you know, I am connected to the sisterhood through my relatives as well as obviously, you know, my friends and my colleagues. So I really loved that. And you know, I think you touched on this a little bit before too, the sort of the negative ramifications of anger. And the ways in which it affects us physically, like not even just emotionally, I'm angry, this is unpleasant, but physically. And I mean, I was just realizing when I was thinking about the book, how in the last 2 years, I have just felt an inordinate amount of physical, you know,
discomfort.
Yes, this idea of, you know, I need an outlet for this energy because I'm suddenly filled with adrenaline for so many different reasons. And you in the book, which is decidedly not a self-help book, but you walk people through ways in which they might put personally and politically transform this rage they're feeling. I believe you call it anger competence, or yes. So can you sort of walk us through what that looked like for you, like how you started that journey? And
so I think what really surprised me in researching the book was how consequential the mismanagement of anger can be. And so in my own case, I had all kinds of physical manifestations that were related to this, but almost every doctor, like my face hurt, right? Like I had something called TMJ, which is when you clench your jaws and it just, everything hurts. And so every doctor I saw pretty much dismissed it as natural life stage stress. Like, you're stressed. I'm like, yes, I am stressed. Not one person ever talked about anger. And I saw a lot of doctors. And there was never any attempt to say, well, what are the sources of the stress? People might say, you really should relax more, get a hobby. You know, why don't you go get like a pedicure? Like, totally not useful. Because in fact, in order for the stress to not affect your body, you have to change what is creating the stress, right?
Yeah.
But that's not really the way this works. I think that women are constantly saying I'm stressed when what they mean is I'm really angry and feel powerless. And it's the nexus of those things that we really need to focus on, right? So what is making you angry and why do you feel powerless? And those two are really powerful to grasp because then you can do something about it. So we do have all kinds of manifestations, and some of them are emotional and mental distress. So anger is a factor and is implicated in anxiety, depression, chronic pain, heart illness. Certain forms of cancer have been linked to suppressed anger. And I knew none of that. I really had no idea. And I think it's important information because we tend to look at certain maladies and just think those are women's sicknesses. And in fact, they're societal problems that have this impact on women. And in the same way that there have been studies about how racial discrimination shortens the lives of Black and brown people, it is just clearly the fact that gender-based and intersectional discrimination affects women's bodies and their well-being. So I think one way of dealing with that is understanding it which in the era of factlessness may not make a difference to some people, but I like understanding it, and I think other people could benefit from understanding it because I didn't understand it, and then you can take steps to think, all right, I am stressed. Relaxation techniques are not going to fundamentally change anything. What has to change? And then I think you feel less powerless. If you're in a job that is horrible and you have an abusive boss or coworkers and you are angry, but you can't actually act on that anger, the course of action might be to make a plan to change the job, but if you feel powerless and just sad about it, that might not occur to you as a reasonable goal, because it's hard to get jobs, it's hard to change. How much is it worth to you, to be a healthier, happier person?
Yeah. And in terms of, there's sort of this framework, right, of rage. There's these systemic and institutionalized forms of discrimination that make us angry, that fuel our anger, that make us uncomfortable and upset. And then there's also this sort of cultural level of, we're also told not to express the anger, we're told the anger is not real. So what sort of, at that level of policies and politics, you talk a lot about, you mentioned that women need to be 70% of the room in order to hold influence in it, which is depressing because we're like 20% of Congress, and that's like an all-time high, and we all see how that's working out. And so what sort of long-term institutional solutions do you see to the rage?
Yeah, a few things. One, again, I always come back to schools. If you're a progressive feminist person, you should be on school boards. And you should get your friends to be on school boards. And as a young parent, I didn't do that much. I was not too keen on institutions and actually probably felt pretty hostile about them. But I think that's super important. If I had to redo anything, it would probably be that, as a parent. But I think you also, schools are one thing. I also think that people need to be held accountable. And that's hard because you have to hold the people in your life accountable as a practice. And if you can do it interpersonally, then you can do it more effectively professionally, and you can do it more effectively politically. And I think we need to support other women. I mean, there's no shortage of women bashing, right?
Yeah.
There's always going to be someone else there to bash the woman. So I'm not saying blind faith all women, or that's not at all what I'm saying. However, if there is a woman who's made a mistake, if there's a woman who's angry, if there's a woman who needs support, be the person who understands that instead of the person who shames and criticizes and undermines, because that's already there, and also develop strong allies professionally and politically, because we know that when people advocate on behalf of themselves, they are, in a professional setting, in a political setting, often penalized for that. And so we need allies who understand the problem and can not paternalistically speak for us, but advocate for the issues that are important for us, and also put a stake in the ground and say, she's just said that 5 times. She just said it 5 times, and yet you ignored her until I said it. That's the kind of change that we need to see in institutions.
Awesome. And you've been doing feminist work for a very long time. And so I'm interested do you feel that activism has provided you with an outlet for that rage?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And then I'm also sort of curious, I hope this doesn't sound flippant, but how do we get in touch with that rage and use it as fuel and still sort of maintain, how do we not get lost in the rage?
So actually, it's so interesting. What I try and say in the book is, so we have this idea that this is a negative emotion. It's part of a cluster of negative emotions, right, and behavior. So there's fear and shame and disgust and contempt, and anger is part of all of that. But anger is also part of justice seeking, compassion, empathy. And honestly, the anger that I've had has led me to joy. It's led me to incredibly wonderful relationships and productive work and good music and art. There are all of these joyful aspects. And so I honestly think that the negativity of anger comes from it not being understood and managed. In and of itself, it's neither positive nor negative, you know, and it has so many different flavors and manifestations. So we keep saying anger, although we probably mean a whole host of things.
Yeah.
But I do think that if you are capable, which takes time, of understanding your anger and then finding the community or increasing the intimacy in your life or changing the situation professionally that's making you so unhappy, that's all good, you know. So part of it is as simple as saying, okay, I think of this overwhelmingly as negative, but in fact, I need to look at how positive it can be, because otherwise you can get consumed in, you know, the sort of darkness of, especially the darkness of the work that we do. There's a lot of darkness. There's a lot of trauma, right?
Yeah.
And it can consume you, and that's not good. And so you have to be able to, I think, take a step back and say, all right, this has happened, or this is something that I want to have happen. How am I going to do that? How do I go from point A to point B in a healthy way?
Yeah. And how have you braced for the backlash when you get angry? I know you talk about harassment. I've been targeted for online harassment. And I mean, when I log into the Ms. account, I am just always blown away by, I'm like, is it like 1856 in here?
It's just stupid. This is the thing. It's mind-bogglingly, like, you just think, how stupid is this? You know? And because that's what it comes down to. And so I don't know if it's sort of bracing for the backlash. We have been living in a prolonged period of backlash. It's, you know, I call one of those chapters the drip, drip, drip.
Yes.
It is ceaseless, you know, and it's exhausting, which is why self-care is such an important issue for activism, because I sometimes wish we had a sort of rotating calendar where people could step forward and step back, because
it's like, this is Carmen's month off.
This is Carmen's
I would
month
also
off.
be
That's
into
right.
that.
You need to rest, and then, you know, I'll take over for a month. Because after Trump was elected and people all of a sudden realized, my God, I have to be an activist. Like, a lot of people came to activism just out of shock and despair. But in fact, one of the things that occurred to me was, okay, do people realize this had to be really sustained? Really sustained, like generationally sustained, you know? And that requires sort of doing what you can do, but then being kind with yourself and saying, I can't do more. I want to actually go see that superhero movie that's hyper violent because it would be fun tonight, and being fine with that, you know?
Yeah.
But it's hard.
Awesome. Well, I'm like, I know we're running out of time, but thank you so much for writing the book, for being here today. I'm like, everyone read fun. Rage Becomes Her, and add it to your Rage syllabus. I know you're tweeting about that too.
Yes, right. Someone else came up with that. I wish I could remember who it was. But I've been tweeting it because, you know, Brittany Cooper's book and Rebecca Traister's book and Gemma Hartley's just written a book called Fed Up, and there's so many other good ones, you know?
Yeah, I'm like, read all the Rageful books. Get in touch with the anger, learn to love it, and stay involved. I'm like, if we can, thank you so much, and we'll see you guys soon.